Hello and welcome. My name is Julie Kennedy, and I am the Regional Manager of Coordinated Entry Services for the Lehigh Valley. As regional managers, we collect information on survivors who are receiving services through victim service providers in our regions, and we connect them in the safest way possible to housing providers in the region that they would like to be housed in. Now, the information that we collect, again, to protect and keep our survivors as safe as possible, it is going to be entered anonymously. So you may be aware that the individual that you're working with is going to be asked to provide what we term as a passcode, a word that they will remember easily and that they will be able to recall easily. We understand that victims have sometimes been experienced or are experiencing crisis, and we can encourage them to try to remember this passcode. It's going to be the one token or key to their record, and only they should have it. It's really important that they don't share that with family members, anyone that could use that information to against them, unfortunately. So I created an account, an HMIS record for us, and I used Rabbit as my passcode. Some of this basic intake information is not something that you will be necessarily filling out on the paper form, but is good to keep note of and just to show you what types of protections are made for survivors in the HMIS database. Now, so I've already created this record, but we will be, go back to our main screen here to show you exactly what happens. The very first question that an individual is asked when they call 211 or they present themselves at an access site is whether they are fleeing domestic violence. It's not specifically asked straightforward like that, but that's what's going on in the intake here. So it's asked in a much more gentle and trauma-informed way. And so they're able to request an anonymous intake to, where they will just be anonymously entered. And so that's what we will be doing for individuals who are working with VSPs. Right, so we're going to say yes. And I'll add a new one. And we'll do DV Rapid again. Now, as you can see, information about social security number. There's a birth date, client ID. We use one universal birth date for every survivor. You will not have to collect a birth date for our purposes. You might for your own in-house records. I will point out, though, that if an individual is 24 years of age or younger, they do qualify as what is called transition age youth. So you would just want to designate that when you're sharing the DAT results with the regional manager, so that this can be relayed to those programs that are specifically created and wrap around youth in the community. So just keep note of that. You don't have to change the birth date. It's just a designation that we make for providers. All right. Social security number, of course, you do not need for this purpose, possibly in-house, but it will not be entered. Now you'll see the name quality is used as a partial or a code name. And it is always a survivor's choice as to whether they want to provide information on veteran status, disability status, any type of status that they feel might be too personally identifying. So they're welcome to refuse it. They're welcome to share it as well. Veterans there are veterans programs for those that identify as having served in the military or currently serving in the military. So it's completely up to them. It is not a requirement. So I'm going to say that DB Rabbit refused today. And this other information is fine. Okay. So what we're looking at here with the universal data assessment is the living situation. Our living situation is the type of residence, the length of stay at the residence just prior to, we're looking at last night, this program admission. All right, so let's say our survivor has left their rental last night. These questions are all pretty important. Did you stay less than 7 nights? This helps determine chronic homelessness, but you can, again, get a no or a yes on that. And just from getting information during the conversation that you have with a survivor, things that you have been made aware of can definitely be used and recalled during your collection of this data. So our survivor here has been there for quite a while, so we'll say no. And then what you will then record is how long this individual was at that prior living situation. I'll say multiple months. You do not have to collect insurance status. Oh, I did miss one thing. Disabling condition. Again, it's their choice whether they want to share that they are living with a disability, or if they aren't, or if they simply do not want to share that for any reason. You'll also see client doesn't know. If they, it's pretty straightforward there. If they don't know, if they say they don't know, you don't have to go any further and you can select that. I'm putting refuse today. Other piece of information, in addition to the data information that we just collected, is the current living situation. So where is this individual right now at this very moment in time? Perhaps they have come to your shelter and they are now enrolled in services in this for your safe house. So today you would say a shelter. This could also be a hotel or motel paid for with a voucher with a subsidy that they're receiving through your agency. At most, it would be, who would want to collect the county that the person was currently in. So we'll say, since it's my region, Lehigh County. Zip code is not necessary, but encouraged. So I'll say 18102. Age range, we would, since it's not personally identifying, it is best to, know that person's age. We will not be using that actual date of birth, but just the range. So the range is large enough. It's been determined that that is not going to be too personally identifying, that it needs to be skipped over. The other pieces here are, again, if a person does not want to share or wants to refuse that, mental health diagnosis, bedrooms needed, why they would need that many bedrooms. Now this, for a survivor, it's very important to collect this type of information because in the full SPDAT assessment, we are only going to reflect one child in the household. There may be multiple children, but in that actual assessment and household count, there will only ever be two if there is at least one child in the household or more. So this area is going to help providers know how many bedrooms are needed so that they are better equipped when they are calling a survivor to know that they're going to be able to meet their needs. So I'm going to say 3. And you may or may not want to put comments there. It's quite fine just to say, just list the number. Serious medical condition. Do you have a serious medical condition, including, and it provides a list, can be refused as well, or person's choice, an answer, a yes, no answer could also be provided. I'm going to refuse that as well. So at this point in time, when you are meeting with a regional manager, this is where you and the manager will be reviewing the DAT assessment, that intake that you completed on paper. And now the regional manager will be entering in HMIS for you so that person can then be added to our by name list. In our next video section, regional manager of the Central Valley, Chris Tapp, and I will be reviewing that SPDAT assessment in full for you.
Okay, are we good to start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you are administering a VSPDAT to somebody who is fleeing domestic violence, we need to reframe some of the questions because the VSPDAT was not actually created for people fleeing DV, but we have found a way to adequately adapt it to that situation to protect their PPI as well as get a more accurate read on what's going on in their world. So we're going to go through, and when you are filling this out, you don't have to worry about this top part. Your regional manager will fill that in for you when you do the relay. And it's very important to select the language so that we know if we need to get a language line translator on the line, as well as the consent to participate. That lets us know that we can share with other providers and help get them some housing. Now, where do you sleep most frequently? If a person is floating from place to place, couch surfing, staying in a friend's house, staying in their own house, you're going to click other. And I usually click other if they're anywhere but a DV shelter. I click other and write fleeing DV. That's all people really need to know.
Agreed. Yes, and it's if they're sharing with you that they're kind of couch hopping, going here to there, they don't really have a place that they're frequently staying at. So again, yeah, that's a good point. Just put fleeing DV.
Right. Now, question 2, how long has it been since you've lived in permanent stable housing? We usually change this. How long has it been since you have felt safe in your housing? Because a person might have been trying to flee or might have been abused for 25 years, but they've never been able to flee until now. But that doesn't mean that their housing has been stable. It doesn't mean that they've been safe in their housing. So let's say this person hasn't felt safe for 3 years. The abuse started 3 years ago. Question 3, in the last 3 years, how many times have you been homeless? I always reword this to, in the last 3 years, how many times have you tried to flee your abuser?
Mm.
So let's say that she tried twice. All right, moving right along. Emergency room is generally self-explanatory. Ambulance, self-explanatory. Hospitalized as an inpatient. I always remind people that that could be for either mental or physical health, because a lot of times we find that folks fleeing DV will end up on a psych hold every once in a while because they just can't take it anymore. Used a crisis service, and I have to remind people what this is. This can be that you reached out to a DV hotline, that you called 211, that you called a minister trying to get away. Anybody that you've called to try to get away from your abuser.
And with the addition of chat on the National Domestic Violence website, it could be a chat service, a text service. There's some apps out there where you can reach a crisis counselor. So anything of that sort.
Correct. All right. Talk to police is pretty self-explanatory. And so is the jail question. Question 5 is an odd one. I always have to reword this. Basically, we're asking, and you're going to ask in a gentle, trauma-informed way, is there physical abuse? Are you fleeing because of physical abuse? So that would be yes. And then, have you threatened or tried to harm yourself or anyone else in the last year? That's pretty self-explanatory. Question 7, do you have any legal stuff going on right now? I always say this includes PFAs. This includes custody disputes with the abuser, anything like that. Question 8, I don't like the way this is worded in general. So I always add, because it makes people feel guilty, right? And nobody wants to feel like they are gullible or taken advantage of. So I always add the word, does anybody try to force or trick you into doing things you don't want to do? That way it takes the blame and the onus off of the survivor and puts it back on the abuser where it belongs.
Or I use the words like coercion. You feel like someone is coercing you, manipulating you,
right,
doing something like refusing to do A unless you do B,
right,
and tend to get a little bit better response from that.
Exactly. And again, with number 9, I always put the onus back on the abuser and take the pressure off of the survivor. Does anybody ever force you to do things that might be risky? Do you ever have no choice but to? Because in trafficking, it's often not a choice. And it is degrading and embarrassing, and we want to do everything we can to preserve people's inherent worth and dignity. All right, number 10. I always simplify this down when dealing with pretty much everybody, but especially folks fleeing DV. Do you have any debt? It could be credit cards, it could be student loans, anything. Do you have any debt in your name?
That's a good way to put it. And also, there's moments where if I've heard a person recollect, provide their story to me and say that someone thinks is a good one in there. Like if there's someone that's saying, like a past landlord that's saying, hey, you didn't pay me X amount of dollars.
Right.
It's a two-pronged thing in a way that there could be very many people saying that you owe me this when you do not.
Right. And I usually simplify number 11 down to, do you have any kind of income?
Makes it much more easy to understand.
Yes. And usually what I find is when people are fleeing DV, there's a whole other level of trauma, and there's a whole other level of not understanding and not wanting to get into the nitty-gritty, and also overthinking. So if we can simplify this down, the better it is for the person that we are interacting with. 12 is pretty self-explanatory. 13 is pretty self-explanatory as well. I don't ask 14 ever. It's always yes. If they're fleeing domestic violence, it's always yes. So there's no reason to make them acknowledge that again. It's just good trauma-informed care to just skip it, mark it yes, move on. And with all of these, if this person has already offered you the information, please go ahead and just fill in the answer to the question, and don't make them answer it again and again and again. For example, earlier in the spit out, I believe question 5, we talked about, was there physical abuse? So for 15, it says, have you ever had to leave an apartment, shelter program, or other place you were staying because of your physical health? That means physical abuse in this case. And if you already know that they have left, don't ask the question, just mark yes. We don't want to be re-traumatizing people. Number 16, people get hung up on this question because it mentions particular organs. I always just stop with, do you have any chronic health issues? Period. Because again, linear thinking in a crisis, they're going to say, well, these organs are fine, but their pancreas doesn't work and they have diabetes. So we want to get an accurate change. I love question 17. I love the way it is worded. I love how gentle it is. And please note that in the SPDAT, it is backwards. There's a help ticket in for that right now, but it is backwards. But I always ask that question as is because I think it's beautifully worded. It's honestly, this is probably my favorite question in the SPDAT as far as gentle wording. 18 is pretty self-explanatory. 19, I always say, when you're sick or not feeling well, do you avoid going to the doctor or getting help because your abuser wouldn't let you, or because you were afraid to be found out, or any other reason? Maybe you couldn't afford it, just any other reason. And I always sort of go into, yeah, sometimes I avoid going to the doctor because I just don't like them. So it takes the guilt off the person again.
Agreed.
And then 20 is fairly obvious. Are you pregnant? All right, 21. We're talking about the abuser here. Did the abuser have drinking or drug use or substance use issues that contributed to the abuse? That's what you're going for with that question. And 22 is about the survivor, right? So just remember, 21 is about the abuser, 22 is about the survivor. 23, A, B, and C are interesting, and we have to be reworded because, and this is more of a conversation than a question, you'll have to discern, was there mental abuse? Was there emotional abuse? Did the abuser have a mental health problem that contributed to the situation? For B, if there was any kind of strangulation or choking, that is a yes. We've been hearing from research that any kind of deprivation of oxygen to the brain from choking or strangulation or beating your head on the wall causes cognitive problems that contribute to exacerbation of barriers. 23 is fairly obvious. Does this person have an IDD issue? Is this person mentally ill? Are they being exploited because they have a mental health concern? And then 24 is also fairly self-explanatory. 25, I always add, are there any medications that you should be taking that you're not taking because either you can't afford them or you weren't allowed to go get them, or that you don't like the way they make you feel because you had to stay awake. You didn't want to take your sleeping medication because you didn't know what would happen to you when you got to sleep. Just really suss that one out. And then 26, I always add, are there any medications that you don't take the way the doctor prescribed, or you sell the medication because you needed to survive, or that you're stretching your medication and not taking it as frequently or at as high of a dosage as your doctor wanted because you need to make it stretch?
Could also be that your abuser is making you take more than you are prescribed as a means of
Correct.
Control.
And then I never ask 27. It's always yes if you're dealing with somebody who is fleeing domestic violence. We're not going to re-traumatize them.
Yeah, the listing of types of abuse can be difficult.
Yes.
Here.
So the least amount of repetition of the trauma, Alexa, quiet. The least amount of repetition of trauma, the better. You're going to want to be as gentle with your survivor as you possibly can, and respect the fact that they are incredibly vulnerable. And it's taking an inordinate amount of bravery to even go through this assessment. And it could also trigger off PTSD and flashbacks. So we want to be really aware of that and do our very best to not allow that to happen, just in the way that we interact with our clients. So this person scored a 16, and what I always do down here for the follow-up questions, I don't put anything in here except the words CRM for contact info. That's it. And I copy paste it straight into all of the other fields that I can, place on the prioritization list. And then before I save it, I always open up the Smartsheet intake form, put in all of the information, make sure everything is good, and then save it out. And clearly I didn't do anything at the top because this is just a training video on how to administer it.
Yes, but I can echo what Chris was saying, how a survivor has already disclosed some items that are going to, be able to provide the responses, and it's that without having to ask them again. And you are completely free to answer those questions based on what they've already disclosed to you without re-traumatizing and asking again. So I appreciate that statement and that we can share that with you because it is super important. No.
Yep, gentleness and compassion are paramount.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, we are here to serve people and we are here to help them. And if we're doing anything that's going to re-traumatize them or make their situation more difficult, we're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.